a result of new information received late last night. The information suggested that Becky's body had been cut up, and a search at the new location resulted in the discovery of body parts.
The shed was ordinary. That was the thing nobody could stop thinking about afterward. An outbuilding in Barton Court, Barton Hill, Bristol. Unremarkable. The kind of structure that exists in the background of every neighborhood, the kind nobody looks at twice. But on the evening of March 3rd, 2015, officers acting on a confession pushed open that door and stepped inside. Before we get too deep, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now let me walk you through the entire thing. What they found was stillness. No sign of disturbance, no chaos, no evidence of panic or hurry. What they found instead were bags and boxes, sealed and stacked, arranged with a precision that investigators would later describe in court as deliberate care. The kind of care that takes time, the kind that requires a clear head. Inside those bags were the remains of a 16-year-old girl. Her name was Rebecca Marie Watts. Everyone who loved her called her Becky. She had been missing for 12 days. 12 days. Think about that number. 12 days during which her father had barely slept. 12 days during which her grandmother had stood before television cameras and begged her to come home.
Bex, if you're watching this, please come home. We love you so much.
They still thought she was staying somewhere, to be honest. I still thought she might be staying somewhere. I don't know if it was wishful thinking.
You're so loved, and I don't think you believe it. You really are so loved. And look at your poor dad. Please come home, or whoever's sheltering there. Do the right thing. Thank you.
12 during which volunteers had walked through parks in the Bristol cold, calling her name into the trees, searching riverbanks, checking every place a young girl might go if she needed to disappear for a while. 12 days of candles and hashtags and community searches and a city holding its breath. And for every single one of those 12 days, she had been here, less than a mile from her front door, sealed, stacked, arranged with deliberate care. There is a detail about this case that lives in a category entirely its own. It is not the discovery in the shed, though that alone would be enough to stop anyone cold. It is not the 12 days. It is not even the name. The detail that separates this case from every other case you have heard about, the detail that makes this story something different, is this. The man who put her there did not run. He did not disappear. He did not go quiet, or keep his distance, or do any of the things that guilt is supposed to make a person do. Instead, he stayed. He sat with her father, night after night in the same rooms, at the same table, inside the same unbearable grief. He gave statements to police. He appeared at the family home. He performed loss so completely, so convincingly, that the people around him never once questioned whether it was real. Hey viewers, if someone close to you went missing tomorrow, would you automatically trust the people around you? Or would something in your gut tell you to look closer? Drop your answer in the comments right now. For 9 days, Nathan Matthews was inside the investigation, not outside it, not watching from a distance, inside it, sitting with the family, speaking to officers, repeating the same story, calm and consistent, every time anyone asked. He had visited the house on the day Becky disappeared. He had not seen her. He heard a door slam. He assumed she had gone out. That was his story. Steady, believable, human, and the shed sat quiet. Nathan Matthews was 28 years old in February 2015. He was Angie Galsworthy's son. Angie was the woman Becky's father, Darren, had married, which made Nathan and Becky stepbrother and stepsister. Two people connected not by blood, but by the decision of two adults to build a life together. Darren would later say he had come to love Nathan like his own sons. They spent weekends together. They were, by every outward measure, a family. That is what makes the next part so difficult to hold. Because on the morning of February 19, 2015, Nathan Matthews arrived at the family home on Crown Hill with a bag. Inside that bag, police would later confirm, were a stun gun, handcuffs, tape, and a mask. He had purchased batteries for that stun gun earlier that same morning. The receipt existed. The CCTV footage existed. The timestamp existed. None of that detail was hidden. It was all there, recorded and waiting, long before anyone thought to look. Becky had come home that morning just after 8. She had been out the night before at a Skittles evening at Barton Hill Rugby Club, staying overnight with a friend. Her friend Adam Dancy, 17 years old, would later describe her last hours in his company as really happy. He said they were just messing about, really laughing. She had been dropped home in good spirits. She was planning to sleep. Her stepmother Angie left the house at approximately 11 that morning for a hospital appointment. Angie suffered from multiple sclerosis and had arranged for a key to be left outside for Nathan, who was planning to visit. At 11:03 a.m., Becky sent a text message to a friend. It was routine, unremarkable. Nothing in it suggested alarm. Nothing in it said goodbye. It was the last time anyone heard from her. What followed inside that house on Crown Hill was later established through forensic evidence. Phone records, CCTV footage, and Nathan Matthews' own admissions under questioning. The prosecution at Bristol Crown Court would open the case with a single defining statement. They described what happened to Becky Watts as a sexually motivated killing. Evidence recovered from devices belonging to both Matthews and his girlfriend Shauna confirmed. In the prosecution's exact words, a shared sexual interest in teenage and petite girls. Matthews would tell investigators he came to Crown Hill that day because he was angry about the way Becky was treating her mother, that she was being disrespectful, that she was endangering Angie's health. His stated intention, the account he offered to the court, was that he only meant to frighten her. He brought handcuffs to frighten a 16-year-old girl. He brought a stun gun, tape, and a mask. Angie returned home at around 12:45 that afternoon. Matthews and Shauna were still there. Other family members came home through the afternoon. Becky's boyfriend Luke arrived that evening, asking after her, and was told they didn't think she was in. Just after 8 o'clock that night, Matthews and Shauna left Crown Hill. They drove back to their home on Cotton Mill Lane in Barton Hill. Becky was in the boot of the car. That night, they ordered a takeaway. They made phone calls. They watched television. They did all the things that ordinary evenings are made of. And none of it looked like anything other than what it appeared to be, because the person doing it had already decided exactly how this was going to go. The following morning, Nathan Matthews left the house. He did not stay hidden. He did not keep still. He got in his car and he drove to a store. And at 12:51 p.m. on February 20th, 2015, a CCTV camera at a B&Q store in Horefield captured his face clearly, without question, without ambiguity. He was standing at a counter. He was making a purchase. Earlier that same morning, he had already been recorded at a local supermarket buying drain cleaner. What he bought at that B&Q store, what he needed it for, that is where this story goes next. The power saw was a Titan brand, available from B&Q for under £50. It was not a specialist tool. It was not unusual. It sat on shelves alongside paint rollers and sanding blocks and every other ordinary instrument of household maintenance, the kind of thing a person might buy on a Tuesday morning without anyone looking twice. Nathan Matthews paid for it in cash. He carried it out to his car. He drove home. What happened at the house on Cotton Mill Lane over the days that followed is not something that can be approached quickly. It requires a kind of steadiness to stay with, because the mind naturally resists it. The mind wants to skip forward, to get past it, to move toward the part of the story that feels more manageable. There is no more manageable part, but this is the part that matters most, because it is the part that reveals the full shape of what Nathan Matthews actually was, not what he appeared to be. Not the version that sat with Darren Galsworthy and made tea and answered questions in a measured voice. The version that came home with a power, saw and drain cleaner and a plan, and carried it out methodically over the course of several days, inside a house where an ordinary life was continuing in every other respect. He dismembered Becky's body. He divided her remains into 8 separate sections. He packaged each section in bin bags and sealed them. He stacked them. He arranged them with the kind of precision that his own barrister would later struggle to explain away. The kind that required not just physical endurance, but a sustained and functional clarity of mind. The kind that required him to stop and assess and continue and stop again and assess again. The kind that does not come from panic. The kind that comes from having already decided, before any of it began, that this was going to be managed. This is the part that investigators returned to again and again during the inquiry and the trial. Not the killing itself, terrible as that was. The aftermath. Because the aftermath told them something the killing alone could not. It told them who they were actually dealing with. A person who acts in rage, who is overwhelmed by what they have done, who falls apart in the aftermath. That person leaves evidence of their falling apart. They make mistakes. They act erratically. They leave traces of their own terror. Nathan Matthews left traces of something else entirely. He left traces of organization, of forward planning, of a mind that was already thinking about outcomes while the act itself was still in progress. Consider the receipts. The stun gun batteries, purchased the morning of February 19th. The drain cleaner and the saw, purchased the following day. Each item acquired when needed. Each acquisition documented on CCTV, time-stamped, unambiguous, and yet, from Matthews' perspective, clearly not concerning enough to avoid. He was not hiding. He was moving through the city as though he had every right to, because, inside his own frame of understanding, he had already accounted for everything. He had already written the ending. It just required him to execute each step in sequence. There is a Shauna Hoare problem that the press spent the weeks of the trial and the months after trying to resolve, and it is a problem worth sitting with. Shauna was 21 years old. She was slight, quiet-voiced, described by those who knew her as someone who faded into the background of whatever room she occupied. She was in a relationship with Nathan Matthews. She had been in that relationship for several years. She knew what was in the bags. She was present in the house during the days the bags were prepared. She appeared at the family home during the search. She sat in the same rooms. She ate meals. She kept the same story. Was she afraid of him? That question was placed in front of the jury and never fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction. The prosecution argued that she was complicit. Her defense argued that she was controlled, that fear had made her passive, that the dynamic between them was not one of equal partnership, but of domination and compliance. The jury heard both arguments across 17 days of testimony and emerged with a verdict that did not entirely satisfy either side. She was acquitted of murder. She was convicted of manslaughter. She was also convicted of perverting the course of justice and of 5 counts of possessing indecent images of children. The indecent images conviction placed her, in the view of many observers, closer to the prosecution's account of her character than her defense team had been able to prevent. But in the days immediately following February 19th, none of this was visible. What was visible was ordinary life, continued with remarkable persistence. The weekend passed. Monday came. Nathan Matthews was at the family home again on the evening of February 20th. Having spent the day at B&Q and the supermarket, he was present, attentive, part of the fabric of concern surrounding a family that had not yet begun to worry, because it was not yet unusual for Becky to be absent for a day or two without explanation. She was 16. She had friends. She had a life that existed partly outside the view of her family. A day was not alarming. 2 days required no formal response. It was not until the evening of February 22nd, a Sunday, that Darren Galsworthy went to the police. By then, Becky had been missing for 3 days. By then, Nathan Matthews had already had 3 days to complete what he had started, to seal and stack and arrange, to carry the bags to the shed in Barton Court and close the door. By then the story was already fully assembled, every piece in place, every answer prepared and rehearsed and ready to be delivered to whoever came asking. And someone was going to come asking very soon. because Bristol was about to wake up. The appeal that went out in the days following Darren Galsworthy's report to police was, by any measure, remarkable in its reach. Social media carried it farther and faster than any previous missing person case in the city. The hashtag #FindBecky spread within hours of the first appeal. Volunteers registered in their hundreds. Organized search parties moved through parks and along the River Avon and across the Netham playing fields. Becky's face was everywhere, her school photograph staring out from lampposts and community notice boards, and the shared feeds of people who had never met her and would never meet her but felt, in the way that social media creates its particular form of mass grief, that they knew her. Her grandmother, Sandra Galsworthy, stood in front of cameras with a composure that cost her visibly every word spoken at Princess, and she said, "Becky, we love you and we just want you home safe. We're not angry. We just want to know you're okay." And at the family home, Nathan Matthews watched the appeal go out. He stayed. He kept staying. Every day he remained inside that circle of grief rather than outside it. Every cup of tea made, and every statement given, and every hour spent visibly, publicly present. Every one of those hours was a choice, the kind of choice that requires not nerve exactly, because nerve implies something precarious, something that might give way. This was not nerve. This was something more structured than nerve, more considered, more cold. It was the choice of someone who had calculated that absence would draw more attention than presence, and who was, on that calculation, entirely correct. The investigation at this stage was still a missing person inquiry, not a murder investigation. There was no body. There was no crime scene. There was only a gap where a 16-year-old girl had been, and the ordinary and terrible work of trying to understand what had filled it. Officers followed leads. Friends were interviewed. Luke, Becky's boyfriend, was spoken to. The last texts were examined. The timeline of the morning of February 19th was reconstructed piece by piece. Nathan Matthews was interviewed, gave his account, was noted as cooperative, and was released. He drove home. The shed door stayed closed. What broke the case open was not, in the end, a breakthrough in the traditional sense. It was not a witness coming forward. It was not a forensic find in the field. It was something smaller and more procedural and, when you understand its implications, more devastating. It was a phone. Specifically, it was the mapping of mobile phone data across the period of Becky's disappearance. The careful, methodical work of building a picture of where every phone in the relevant network had been and when. This kind of analysis is painstaking and unremarkable from the outside. The kind of work that happens in offices rather than on streets, that produces spreadsheets rather than revelations. It produces results with a slowness that investigations can barely afford and cannot do without. And it was in that analysis that a shape began to emerge. A pattern of movement that did not match the account that had been given. A phone that had been where it should not have been, or had not been where it should have been, depending on which part of the timeline you were examining. A discrepancies, small, precise, the kind that once seen cannot be unseen. Nathan Matthews was brought in again. He did not know, when he walked into that interview room for the second time, exactly what they had. He knew what he had done. He knew the shape of his own story and the places where it was most vulnerable. But the specific shape of what they were holding, that he could not be entirely certain of. And uncertainty, for someone who has been operating on the basis of certainty, is its own kind of exposure. It lasted several hours. At its conclusion, Nathan Matthews had not confessed. He had adjusted his account, shifted it in certain places, walked back from others, added new details that had previously been unavailable to him, due, he suggested, to the stress of the situation. The investigators noted the adjustments. They mapped them against what they already knew. They went back to the phone data. They went back to the CCTV footage. They went back to the receipts. And they started to look at people who were close to him. They started to look at people who might know something. One of those people was in a house not far from Cotton Mill Lane, sitting with something she had been sitting with for 11 days. Something that had been getting heavier every morning. She woke up and chose, again, to say nothing. She was about to make a different choice. Her name was Jadine Parsons. She was a neighbor. She was, by the time this was over, a person who to live with the precise and particular weight of knowing that she had information during 11 days of active searching, 11 days of volunteers calling a dead girl's name across the cold parks of Bristol, and had said nothing. What she said when she finally did speak, and who she said it to, and what was done with it. That sequence of events moved at a speed that no other part of this investigation had managed, because what Jadine Parsons described to police on the evening of March 2nd, 2015 was not a suspicion. It was not a vague unease or a feeling she couldn't substantiate. It was specific. It was located. It was a shed on Barton Court. She had seen Nathan Matthews visiting in the days following Becky's disappearance, carrying bags, more than once, in the dark, with a purposefulness that had lodged itself somewhere in the back of her mind and refused to leave. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself she must be wrong. She had performed the ordinary and entirely human calculation that most people perform when they find themselves in proximity to something that their instincts are telling them is catastrophically wrong. The calculation that says, this cannot be what it looks like, because that would mean something too large and terrible to hold. The math of refusal, the arithmetic of not wanting to be the person who looked at their neighbor and saw a monster. But 11 days is a long time to maintain a refusal. The shed was searched on the morning of March 3rd. The attending officers were acting on information. They knew, broadly, what the information was pointing toward. Knowing and encountering are different things, and what they encountered inside that shed, the bags, the sealed and stacked and carefully arranged bags, the stillness of it, the organization of it, the complete absence of anything that looked like haste or panic or shame, was something that several of those officers would later describe as one of the most disturbing things they had encountered in their professional lives. Not because of what it contained, though that alone was beyond ordinary language. Because of what it communicated about the person who had built it, about the state of mind it represented, about what kind of creature could construct something like this, and then spend 9 days sitting at a kitchen table with a grieving father, making tea, giving statements, performing care. The call to Darren Galsworthy was made that same afternoon. What do you say to a man in that moment? What do you say to a father who has been searching for his daughter for 12 days, who has stood before cameras and asked her to come home, who has sat across from his stepson night after night and been held up by the presence of someone he trusted, someone he loved like a son, someone who always knew, where she was? There are no words adequate to that phone call. There are only the words that were used, whatever they were, and the silence that came after them. Darren Galsworthy had been sitting at the kitchen's table when his phone rang. He would later describe those subsequent hours as a period he cannot account for, in the sense that memory refuses to organize them into sequence. They exist for him as fragments, as a sound he made that he didn't recognize as himself, as people arriving and the rooms filling with a different kind of people than had filled them before, not supporters and volunteers and family members holding each other up, but officers, suited figures, people with a specific professional purpose moving through rooms that now constituted a secondary scene. Nathan Matthews was arrested the following morning, March 4th, 2015. It was a Tuesday. It was unremarkable weather. He was arrested at Cotton Mill Lane with the kind of procedural orderliness that violent crimes, when they resolve, often produce. The same calm surface that had characterized every stage of his conduct throughout, now replicated in the conduct of those who came for him. Shauna Hoare was arrested separately. Both were taken in for questioning. Both were charged. The investigation that followed between the arrests in March and the opening of the trial at Bristol Crown Court in October assembled a record of what had happened with a comprehensiveness that left almost no question formally unanswered. Almost none. The forensic case was substantial. The digital evidence was substantial. The CCTV record was substantial. The phone data was substantial. The purchase history was substantial. Taken together, these elements constructed a timeline so complete, so precise in its documentation, that the defense was left with very little room. What the defense had was motive. Not in the sense of providing one, they could not do that. In the sense of contesting the one the prosecution offered. The prosecution's case was that there was a sexually motivated killing, that Nathan Matthews had gone to Crown Hill on the morning of February 19th with the intention of abducting his 16-year-old stepsister, that the stun gun and the handcuffs and the tape were not instruments of a plan to frighten her, but instruments of a plan to take her. The prosecution pointed to the material recovered from his devices and Shauna's devices. The searches, the images, the explicit documented interest in teenage and petite girls, and they argued that this material did not represent an incidental background detail. They argued it was the context in which the plan had formed, the environment in which a 16-year-old girl had become a target. The defense could not make that material disappear. They could not argue that the bags in the shed told a different story than the one everyone could see. What they could argue was what Matthews himself had said from the beginning, that this had not been planned, that he had arrived in anger, that something had happened in the house that morning, some confrontation, some escalation, and that Becky had died, not as the result of a premeditated abduction, but as the result of something more sudden and therefore in the precise legal calculus of murder law. Something that might constitute a different charge, carrying a different weight. The jury took 2.5 days to reject that argument. Nathan Matthews was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to a minimum of 33 years. Shauna Hoare received a minimum of 17 years on the manslaughter conviction, with additional concurrent terms for the other offenses. In the public gallery, Darren Galsworthy sat through all of it. There is an image that exists from outside the court on the day of the verdict, not a photograph exactly, more a description that was repeated by several journalists who were present. Darren Galsworthy, standing on the steps of Bristol Crown Court in the October afternoon, flanked by family members and a family liaison officer, reading a statement in a voice that shook in some places and held in others, the way a structure holds when it has been tested past what it was built to bear. He said Becky had been full of life and cheeky and funny, and he would miss her every day for the rest of his. He said justice had been done, though he was careful about the word justice, because he understood that justice in the legal sense and justice in the human sense are not the same thing, and had no interest in pretending otherwise. He did not mention Nathan Matthews by name. He did not say the word stepson. He spoke about Becky. He kept it on Becky. And then he folded the statement and went back inside, and the October afternoon continued around him, ordinary and unhelpful, full of the ordinary city noise that carries on regardless, that knows nothing about what it is carrying through. The trial, in its public and formal dimensions, was over. But there was a question that the trial had not answered. Not a legal question. Those had been settled with sufficient clarity. A different kind of question. The kind that does not submit to the procedures of a court, because it exists below the level that those procedures can reach. The kind that the people closest to this case went home with and woke up with, and carried forward into the months and years that came after. The question was about knowing. About what it is possible to know about a person you love. About the gap between the person you believe someone to be and the person they actually are. About whether that gap is detectable, whether there are signals, whether a sufficiently attentive person could have seen something in Nathan Matthews. In the years before February 2015, in the ordinary Sundays and shared meals and family occasions, that would have told them what was actually there. And the terrifying answer, the one that the evidence record forces you toward, is that there may have been nothing. Nothing visible. Nothing that would have resolved into signal rather than noise under ordinary scrutiny. No pattern of behavior that, in isolation, would have been sufficient to condemn him, because patterns of behavior of the kind Matthews exhibited are specifically characterized by their capacity to coexist with normalcy, with warmth, with the ordinary markers of a functioning social life. That is what makes this case different from the cases where the monster is, in retrospect, legible, where the neighbors later say they always thought something was off, where the warning signs are visible in hindsight, and at least graspable in theory. This case does not offer that consolation. This case offers the harder thing, the thing that is more difficult to sit with. The possibility that the person you are sharing a meal with, the person you have welcomed into your family, the person you would describe without hesitation as someone you trust, could be holding something inside them that no amount of ordinary human attention would ever reach. The shed door stays closed, right up until the moment it doesn't. And there is one more thing, one detail that the trial produced, and that the coverage of the trial noted, and that then became, with time, the detail that got left out of the summaries, the one that fell away as the story settled into the version that gets repeated. It is small. It requires holding two things at once. But it is the detail that, once known, fundamentally changes the shape of the question about who Nathan Matthews was. He had a child, a baby daughter, born in the months before February 2015, his own, present in the house on Cotton Mill Lane during some of the days in question, tended to, fed, put down to sleep, picked up when she cried, while the bags sat sealed in the shed on Barton Court and the searches continued, and Darren Galsworthy barely slept. He did all of it. Both things, simultaneously. Grief does not follow the schedule that the public dimension of tragedy sets for it. The verdict came down in November 2015. The news cycle so absorbed it and moved on with the speed that news cycles move, leaving behind the Galsworthy family and the city of Bristol and the specific weight of a particular kind of loss. The kind that is not just about the person gone, but about the architecture of trust that collapsed alongside them. Darren Galsworthy had loved Nathan Matthews for years, not abstractly, not as a formal acknowledgement of the relationship his marriage created. He had loved him in the specific and ordinary ways that fathers love the children who come to them, through circumstance rather than blood. The shared evenings, the small loyalties, the accumulated history of being in the same rooms through the seasons of a family life. He had sat beside Nathan during the 12 days of the search, and he had been held up by that proximity. And the thing that held him up had been a lie constructed specifically to hold him up, built by the person who had built it so that it would serve that exact purpose. The psychological literature on betrayal trauma makes a distinction that is easy to state and almost impossible to fully absorb. It distinguishes between betrayal by a stranger or an institution and betrayal by someone to whom you have given trust, love, proximity. By someone who knew the precise shape of your vulnerability and used that knowledge not accidentally, but with intention. The second category produces a specific kind of damage, not just grief for the person lost, which would be damage enough, but a retroactive corruption of every memory that preceded the loss. Every shared meal, every ordinary evening, every moment of comfort received from the person who was already planning or already capable of the thing that destroyed you. None of those memories can be recovered unchanged. They have to be reprocessed entirely, re-examined in a light that turns them into something other than what they felt like when they happened. Darren Galsworthy was doing that reprocessing while also burying his daughter. The funeral for Becky Watts took place in March 2015, shortly after the identification of her remains. It was a private service, though its private nature did not prevent the city from gathering in its own way outside. Flowers left along the roads she used to walk, on lampposts, on the gates of places she had frequented. Bristol had invested something real in the search for Becky, not just the volunteers who had walked the parks and called her name. The families who had shared the hashtag, the strangers who had printed her photograph and taped it to community notice boards. There was a communal version of this grief running alongside the private version, and the two existed in the strange parallel that mass public mourning always creates, genuine in its own terms, but unable to reach the thing it is trying to reach, which is the particular and unrepeatable reality of a specific person. Becky's friends described her in the ways that the people who actually knew her can describe someone who is gone, not in the broad strokes of victim narratives, not brave or angelic or purely innocent, the language that tragedy applies to young people who die and that flattens them into symbols. In the small strokes, the fact that she liked to argue, that she could be stubborn, that she had a sense of humor that ran toward the dark and the dry and could catch you off guard, that she was protective of the people she loved and less careful than she should have been about the people she didn't know well. That she was, in other words, a person in the process of becoming, unfinished, complicated, specific, real, 16 years old. She had a future that the court proceedings could only gesture toward in the vaguest terms, the way court proceedings always must, because a future cannot be put in evidence. A life that was not lived cannot be documented or cross-examined or entered into the record. It exists only as absence, and absence is the one thing that the legal process is structurally unable to address. The law can sentence Nathan Matthews to a minimum of 33 years. It cannot give back a single day of what it took. There is something about the geography of this case that needs to be held. Barton Hill is not a large place. The distances involved, between Crown Hill, where Becky lived, and Cotton Mill Lane, where Nathan and Shauna lived, and Barton Court, where the shed stood. These are the distances of a neighborhood. The kind of distances covered in minutes. The kind where you might pass someone on the pavement and lift a hand in recognition. The kind where community is not an abstraction but a physical fact, a product of proximity, of shared streets and shared amenities, and the ordinary texture of urban living. Becky's remains were stored within that community for 12 days. The searches took place within that community. The candles were lit within that community. The volunteers gathered and dispersed within that community. And somewhere in those streets, on those evenings, Darren Galsworthy and Nathan Matthews occupied the same grief. Think about that geography. Think about what it costs. The question that the family's left with. The one that the investigation answered in its formal dimensions and left entirely unanswered in its human ones was the question of concealment, not how. The how was documented, time-stamped, entered into evidence, subjected to expert testimony. Not even the why, which the prosecution addressed in its stated terms and which Matthews addressed in his different terms and which the jury resolved in the prosecution's favor. The question underneath both of those was a third question, quieter and harder. What was he planning? Because the evidence of premeditation, the bag with its contents assembled and purchased in advance, the batteries bought the morning of the killing, the drain cleaner and saw acquired the following day. That evidence established that this was not an act of sudden violence, that something had been forming before February 19th, that the decision, in some form, had already been made before he walked through the door of the house on Crown Hill with a bag containing a stun gun and handcuffs and tape. What was he planning to do with a 16-year-old girl in handcuffs? The prosecution answered that question in the terms available to it. The jury accepted that answer. But the answer lives beyond the courtroom in a different register, not as a legal conclusion, but as an image, as a thing that was intended. As the gap between what was planned and what actually happened, a gap that exists somewhere in the sequence of events inside that house on the morning of February 19th, and that the evidence record can establish, the edges of but cannot fully illuminate. Becky fought back. This much the forensic evidence established. She did not simply submit. She was 16 years old, and she was alone in a house with someone she had grown up with, someone she had reason to trust, someone who had arrived at her door in circumstances that could plausibly seem ordinary. And she fought. Whatever she understood about what was happening to her, her body's response was resistance. The marks of the struggle were present. The struggle itself was brief, as such struggles are, measured in seconds rather than minutes, resolved by the physics of the situation rather than by anything that will or courage or love could have altered. That detail belongs to her. The weeks following the conviction produced the usual taxonomy of response that high-profile cases generate. Calls for stricter regulation of certain categories of online material. Discussions about the adequacy of the sentences. Debate about Shauna Hoare's acquittal on the murder charge. Op-eds about the nature of coercive control and how it interacts with criminal culpability. Each of these conversations was legitimate in its own terms, and each of them was, in the most important sense, beside the point. The point was Darren Galsworthy, rebuilding. The point was Sandra Galsworthy, carrying. The point was Becky's boyfriend Luke, who was 17 years old when he lost her, standing on a pavement in Bristol, asking a closed door where she was. The point was the friend who last saw her on the morning of February 19th, who had been with her at the Skittles evening, who had described her as really happy, just messing about, really laughing, and who had said goodbye to her not knowing it was goodbye. The point was all the ordinary and specific things that those people had to continue doing in the absence of the person whose ordinariness and specificity they were still holding, still counting, still reaching for in the moments when grief gets past the defenses and you forget, just for a second, that the person is gone. There is one final thing about Nathan Matthews, one detail that investigators noted and that the sentencing judge referenced and that has sat, since then, in the background of every account of this case, like something that refuses to be absorbed. He showed no remorse, not a performance of remorse that failed under scrutiny, not an attempt at remorse that was judged inadequate. The absence was complete. Throughout the trial, through the testimony, through the evidence, through the reading of the verdict, through the sentencing remarks. Nothing in his presentation suggested that the weight of what he had done had reached him. Nothing suggested that the distance between the life he had taken and his own continuing life was felt by him as a distance at all, which returns us to the question underneath all the questions. The one that this case makes unavoidable. What do we actually know about the people we love? Not in the sense of facts, not in the sense of the information we hold about a person. Their habits and preferences and histories and moods and the way they take their tea and the things that make them laugh. In the deeper sense. The sense of what exists in a person below the threshold of everything they choose to show. The interior that is never fully visible. The thing that all relationships are in some degree built on faith rather than knowledge. Nathan Matthews had been inside Darren Galsworthy's faith for years. The shed on Barton Court is gone now. The houses around it continue. The streets of Barton Hill continue. The city continues. And the question continues inside all of it, quiet and unresolvable and present in every close relationship, every trusted face, every ordinary evening with the people you have decided to believe in. You cannot see inside a person. You never could. The door was always closed. You just didn't know there was a door. There is a thing that happens to families after cases like this one. Not during the investigation, not during the trial, not in the immediate aftermath, when the structures of procedure and public attention hold everything temporarily in place afterward. In the ordinary time that follows, when the cameras have gone and the journalists have moved on and the legal process has concluded and there is nothing left but the life that has to be lived inside what remains. Darren Galsworthy had to continue being a person. That sounds simple. It is the most demanding thing there is. To get up in the morning and move through the hours and eat and speak and sleep and wake again, carrying the specific weight of what he carried. Not just the loss of his daughter, which would have been weight enough for any life, but the knowledge of how she was lost. The knowledge of who was sitting across from him during the 12 days. The knowledge that his own grief had been used as cover, that his love for a stepson had been weaponized, that the comfort he drew from Nathan Matthews' presence during those terrible nights was a comfort that Matthews had calculated and offered with full knowledge of what he had done and where she was. You cannot unfeel the comfort. That is the cruelest part. You cannot go back and not have been held up by it. It happened. It is part of the record of your life. You were in agony, and someone sat with you, and it helped, and the helping was a lie, and you cannot undo the fact that it helped. Becky would have been 27 this year. That number sits differently than the facts of the case. The facts of the case are terrible in the ways that terrible things are terrible, measurable, documentable, subject to language. The number sits in a different place. 27 is a whole imagined life. It is the person she was still becoming when she was stopped, the arguments she hadn't had yet, the things she hadn't decided about herself, the ordinary accumulation of experience and change and revision that constitutes a human being in the process of existing. All of it foreclosed on a February morning in a house in Bristol by a man with a bag and a plan and a willingness to sit at a table for 9 days and look the people he had destroyed in the face. 27. She would have been 27. The volunteers who searched for her in February 2015 are 11 years older now. The friend who last saw her laughing is 28. Her boyfriend Luke is 28. The city has continued at its ordinary pace, absorbing this as cities absorb everything, not forgetting exactly, but incorporating, folding the memory into the ongoing texture of place, the way places hold the things that happened in them without advertising it. You can walk those streets now, and nothing marks them as the streets they were. The same pavements, the same distances, the same ordinary geography of a neighborhood that doesn't know it's being looked at. The shed is gone, but the question it produced is still there, still sitting in the structure of this story, and in the structure of every close relationship, and in the space between what we believe about the people we love and what is actually true of them. That question does not go away when a case concludes. It doesn't go away when a sentence is handed down, or when the coverage stops, or when the years accumulate and the specific details begin to blur at the edges for everyone except the people who cannot afford to let them blur. Darren Galsworthy cannot afford to let them blur. He carries a precise and detailed knowledge that no verdict and no sentence and no passage of time will ever make less precise or less detailed. He carries the image of what was in the shed. He carries the 12 days. He carries every cup of tea. He carries the knowledge that the last person to see his daughter alive was the first person to comfort him for losing her, and that this was not an accident or a coincidence or a product of circumstance, but a choice, made deliberately, sustained deliberately, for 9 days without flinching. This is what the law cannot address. This is what 33 years in a prison cell cannot address. Not because the sentence is inadequate in legal terms, but because the thing it is responding to is not, at its core, a legal thing. It is a human thing, an ancient and unanswerable thing about the darkness that can exist inside a person who presents to every available instrument of ordinary perception as someone worth trusting. We talk about monsters as though they are recognizable, as though the category announces itself, as though there is something in the face, or the bearing, or the pattern of small daily behaviors that resolves, under sufficient scrutiny, into signal. We tell ourselves this because the alternative is more frightening than most people can comfortably hold. The alternative is that the category is invisible, that it sits inside ordinary life, inside ordinary families, inside the ordinary trust that ordinary people extend to the people they have chosen to love. And it waits, and it does not announce itself, and there is no instrument sharp enough to find it before the door opens, and you finally see what was on the other side all along. Becky Watts was 16 years old. Was cheeky and stubborn and funny and real, and she fought at the end with everything she had. She deserved the 27 years she didn't get. She deserved the life she was in the middle of building. She deserved to come home. She was less than a mile from her front door the whole time. In the next video, we go inside a case where the family knew something was wrong from the very first hour. and the police didn't believe them for 6 years. Some doors, it turns out, were never really closed at all.